example. And in my example, I'm going to be using this curved arrow icon with check marks just to represent the overall content production cycle from planning through to publishing. So here's what typically happens in most organizations. Okay, so after many of these content production cycles, an accessibility audit will be conducted, maybe in response to a lawsuit, right? So hundreds of accessibility issues will be found in the audit, and those accessibility issues will be remediated. But meanwhile, in the background, the publishing of more inaccessible content and features will continue until the next lawsuit, okay? Then another audit will be conducted, requiring further remediation, and on, okay? Does anyone recognize this? Has this happened to anybody before? Yeah. So this is what I'm calling the remediation cycle. So today, hopefully, we're gonna get some strategies together and help you escape that remediation cycle at your organization or for your clients that you work with, because relying on continuous audit and remediation cycles without addressing the processes that lead to those inaccessible issues on the sites is inefficient, and it prevents sustainable accessibility. So this is going to be a lot of information. I realized when I was trying to put this together, this is not an easy topic to cover, and I want to keep it as conversational as possible, so please feel free to ask questions. I'm actually going to pause after I have 3 sections, and I'm going to pause at the end of each section and see if anyone has any questions, and Lourdes has the microphone if you have any questions. And yeah, you can also feel free to sort of raise your hand and interrupt. It's fine. Please do so. So the 3 topics that I'm going to cover today. First, I just need to talk about some foundational elements, just because there are a few things that you need to have in place to make it possible for you to do what I'm going to talk about in section 2, which is embedding sustainable accessibility practices into your workflows. And then finally, the third thing that we're going to talk about is how do you get team alignment in order to implement your sustainable accessibility strategy. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's dive into foundational requirements for sustainable accessibility. We're going to talk about 4 topics in this section of sort of prerequisites. Just the first one, assessing and documenting the current state of accessibility for your digital experience. Number 2, creating this really critical thing that I call a component safe list. So I'm going to describe what I mean by that and why it's important. Number 3, we're going to talk about setting some important accessibility milestones for your team, kind of at the onset before you continue on to do this important work. And then finally, just a general section on setting up team training and onboarding, because a lot of our clients have a lot of questions about, tips on the best ways to do this to make it effective. Right? So topic number 1, assessing and documenting your digital experience's current state of accessibility. So this is something that you really should do, like kind of before you get started trying to fix your processes. It's really important that you know what your current state is, so you can describe that to team members. Maybe you have to build a business case for why you're doing this. For whatever reason, it's just important to know where you're starting from. And the best way to do that really is to do an accessibility audit. Okay, so the best way, I'm not going to go into how to do an audit, of course, in this presentation. There's lots of presentations touching on that here. But I will give you a few tips. So tip number 1, it's best to do a full audit of all of the representative content and functionality across your organization's site or your client's site, whatever. When we do a full audit at Sapien, it usually takes us about 2 weeks to cover off all of the representative content and features, but maybe you don't have 2 weeks. Maybe that's a lot of time and you have other stuff that you need to do. So if you don't have enough time to do the full audit, you could also audit a smaller number of recently created pages. And I just say to stick with that recently created stuff because you want to make sure that it's relevant to what your team's working on today. Like you don't want to go to your stakeholder and say, look, I found 10 issues with this component, and they're like, yeah, we retired that, we don't use it anymore, and then you're kind of sunk with that time you invested. Okay, so if you stick with recent pages, it's best. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you'd be able to hit the hide button at the bottom of your screen.
Oh yes. Absolutely. Oh. Uh-oh.
Oh, does that hide the presentation?
I don't know. No, I think it's okay. Okay, just it popped up some things are always popping up. Okay, and then with this second one, also I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you want to employ thorough test methods. It's really important to do manual testing when you're doing this current state audit. You don't want to, it could be really tempting to try and just rely on an automated tool, but as everybody in this room probably knows, that's not going to give you the full picture of accessibility. And then the other thing that you want to do is make sure that you're assessing by page, and also if there's like a user flow that someone is supposed to be doing on your site, test all along that user flow too, and make sure that you can get from the beginning to the end of that successfully. So when you're doing this audit, this third piece, you're probably doing this anyway, but you're probably creating a backlog of issues. I assume everyone probably has an issue tracking system where they log bugs. But this little different nuance that you might not be doing is it's really important in order to create that component safe list that I'm talking about, that when you find an accessibility issue, you map it in the system to the component that's affected. Okay, so all of the issues with your global navigation, you tag it or label it as global navigation, and this will help you make your component safe list later, and I'll get to that. And then the other thing that we're also probably already doing is categorize issues by severity based on impact to the user. So this is really, really, really important. So just on the off chance that people aren't doing that, I'm going to touch on that a little bit for just a couple of minutes. I'm showing you the issue prioritization framework that we have for accessibility issues at Publicis Sapient. And you know, obviously when you prioritize issues, it just helps teams understand what they should fix first. And the point of me showing you the one that we use today is because we have our accessibility issue severity definitions described based on their impact to the user. So I'm showing 4 different definitions on my screen, an S1 through an S4, and the S stands for severity. And so I'm just going to go through and tell you what those are. So an S1 is something that we define as a critical issue. So our definition of a critical issue is that some people cannot access content depending on how they navigate. So for example, if something didn't work with the keyboard, we would log that as an S1. It's supposed to work with the keyboard. An S2 we define as a serious issue, and that means that somebody might require a workaround, again, depending on how they need to access content. So a classic one for this is if the text doesn't meet contrast requirements, and some people might need to override the style sheet with their own custom style sheet. They shouldn't need to do that workaround, so we call that an S2 issue. An S3 issue is major. That means that content can be accessed by everyone, but there's some feature that's missing or wrong. So for example, if the skip to content link is missing or broken, then we would log that as an S3. And then finally, we have an S4 minor issue, and that means that content can be accessed by everyone, but some people are forced to work through annoyances. So something I put in this category is, say there's redundant alternate text all over the site, and if I use a screen reader, I have to hear everything twice. That's annoying. So that is an S4 issue. And as I move through this presentation today, when I refer to high severity issues, I'm talking about these S1 and S2 issues. And when I refer to lower severity issues, I'm talking about S3 and S4 issues. And a lot of the teams I work with get confused, and they're like, but are they all issues? Like if it's an S4, does that mean I don't need to fix it? And of course, anything that we log is not meeting one of the WCAG success criteria. They're all issues. This is just a prioritization framework. They all should get fixed, is my answer that I tell the teams. Okay, so getting back to your audit results. You need to prioritize your issues, map them to affected components to create that component safe list that I'm talking about. All right, so what's a component safe list? It's essentially a dashboard that's connected to your defect tracking system, and most issue tracking systems have the ability to create a dashboard. We use Jira a lot at Sapient. So it's a dashboard that shows you all the components in your component library and all of the issues that are affecting each of those components, and it shows the severity level for each of the issues. Okay, and I'm going to show you a screenshot of a dashboard so you get an idea. But just In the interest of just telling you steps of how to do things, so what we do is we tag accessibility issues in the backlog by component, as I mentioned. We have that dashboard set up that shows the components and their issue counts, and the issues are prioritized S1 to S4 based on user impact. And what's the point of this? I'm going to show you on the next screen, but once you have this dashboard in place, it makes it a lot easier to talk to teams about avoiding reusing components with high severity issues until those issues are fixed, right? Because now they have a nice view, and I'm gonna show you, here's an accessibility dashboard. For one of our clients, you can see along the left side, there are all the component names, and then in columns on the right, it shows the count of accessibility issues by severity level. You can see maybe you can notice that there's no S1 issues. So this client has gone in and made sure that we fixed all the S1 issues, so there are no more. But there are two components that I've highlighted, the control bar and the gallery. And the reason why I highlighted them is that they both have critical issues. So they both have S2 issues. So what I would do when I'm working with teams, and this helps when you're planning for new content, is if anyone came and said, hey, I want to use the control bar on a new page and I want to do this and that, then I would say, oh, sorry, you can't use the control bar right now. It's basically retired for ongoing use until it gets the issues fixed. Do you have time in your project to fix those issues? Because if you can fix the issues, then you can use the control bar. So it just gives you a little bit of leverage and helps you kind of get to that place where you're starting to work in a more sustainable way for accessibility, even in this prerequisites section. All right. So this kind of gets to the idea of setting accessibility milestones for your team. So maybe that might have seemed like a scary proposition. Like if you're in the position working on the website and the creative director comes up to you and says, hey, I want to use the control bar, it might seem a little bit scary to tell that creative director, like, no, sorry, you can't use it. And maybe you don't get there right away, right? But this is where you can set milestones, okay? So the first milestone, and I'm showing you 3 milestones here that we always try and set at the beginning with our clients. Okay, so the first one that we set is that proposed cutoff date, after which you cannot create any new content on the website that has a high severity accessibility issue. Okay, and that would include those components in the list. So maybe you're not saying no to the creative director today, but you're saying, hey, there's a date in the future, maybe it's a month from now, we're not going to be using these issues or these components with high severity issues anymore. You might want to get it into your plan to kind of get these things fixed if you're going to want to use them past this date. And then when they come to you later and say, hey, how come I can't use the control bar? You can remind them, oh, remember, we set that milestone date, the cutoff date to publish updates with high severity issues. The next deadline that I recommend that you try and set is the deadline to resolve all of the high severity issues across the site, okay? And like these are the really important issues that are impacting people, right? So let's get those cleaned up in 3 months, right? And you know your organization and how long it could take. You probably have an idea of effort required to fix some of these things. So, you can move that date accordingly, right? It's going to take your team 4 months to fix those issues, but the point is to just put a line in the sand, and you may have to negotiate it, but just get them to agree on some date. And then finally, the proposed target date to reduce the percentage of the lower severity accessibility issues. Now, you'll never be able to fix all the issues, and I feel pretty confident saying that. I've never seen a digital experience that didn't have some kind of accessibility issue, right? So the goal isn't to get it to be perfect, but just to always be looking ahead in the future and planning, hey, I want to try and finish, say there's 50 lower severity issues. I want to fix all the P3s by this date, or I want to have half of them fixed by this date, and then you can start to measure your progress. And that's another thing that you should start thinking about. If you don't have any milestones, if you don't have any goals that you're trying to hit, or they're kind of ephemeral goals, like I just want things to get better, that's not very measurable. So when you have these milestones, maybe you don't hit them, but if you start reporting on your milestones, then people can see the progress that you're making and what a difference it makes to have an accessibility specialist on the team. So it just makes these conversations kind of more impactful. All right, and then the last thing I want to cover in this sort of prerequisite section is setting up team training and onboarding. So these are the types of training that we set up with our clients, and it works pretty well just as long as everybody takes the training. Okay, so I have a bunch of strategies that hopefully will help you to get your people to take their training. All right, so the first thing that we do is we provide foundational accessibility training. So for us, this consists of an introduction to accessibility that everybody needs to take that just gives everyone kind of a common baseline. We show them a screen reader demonstration, for example, just tell them why it's important, the benefits, all of that wonderful content that you're familiar with. And then the other thing that we do is we make everybody take screen reader training. And that's not because we expect them to become screen reader power users who are actually doing testing, but just what I find that it's really good at doing is it's good at opening someone's mind who thought they knew everything, and now they realize, whoa, there's like this whole thing that I had no idea existed. And it's great to get people in that more vulnerable space, and they start to want to think differently. I've seen it happen, and it really is a beautiful thing. So that's the foundational accessibility training, and what we do is we record it and we make it available so that anyone can watch it, whenever they need to. Again, we have another type of training, so role-specific accessibility training. So this is, the point of this is, there's a lot to know about accessibility, right? Like I just keep learning new things all the time. So I don't want to overwhelm my team by making the designer learn all the developer stuff and the developer learn the designer stuff. Instead, we target our sessions and teach everybody what they need to know about their own discipline. And what this does is it enables them to apply accessibility best practices within the domains that they control. Okay, because the other thing is it can get kind of frustrating if you know everything about alt text, but you're a developer and you never get to write anything because that's not your job. You're supposed to be coding, not creating content. So role-specific accessibility training, it's efficient, and they can complete it quickly and they get to know what they need to know. And then finally, the third thing that we do is we provide accessibility resources. So that could be tailored training sessions. If a particular team is struggling in one specific area that we don't have a training for, then we can develop a training to help them. Accessibility checklists by discipline, just having those there. I know that a checklist is not enough on its own, but it can be a good helper for somebody. And then also letting them know what our recommended automated tools are to help them streamline their workflows. And that's really important. Everyone wants to streamline their workflow. It's great if an accessibility specialist is suggesting the tool, and then you know that it's a good tool that you approve of. Okay, so I mentioned that we have our training available for recording, and we have a system set up where we keep track of who takes it. And it's mandatory, so everyone's supposed to take it. And so at different intervals, I can look and see, what percentage of people have taken it, and I can cut this data different ways. So a lot of times people have not taken their training yet, right? I said we had a company of 20,000 people. There's a lot of people who haven't taken that training, and I really want them to take it. So let's talk about touch points where we can promote our accessibility training, and we can require our accessibility training to be taken. So the best time that you can get people to take training is as soon as they started working at your company, right? They just started working, they're eager, they're excited, they don't know anything, you tell them they have to take it, and they're like, okay, and they take it right away, and that's great because, they're getting that idea that we care about accessibility at this company. All right. If you have a bunch of people, obviously, at your company who did not just start and they haven't taken their training, how about when a new project begins? Again, it's a new beginning, you're kicking something off. It's a great time to get someone to take training because they're just kind of excited about this new project, whatever it is. Maybe you're redesigning your website. And you tell them, hey, in order to be on this project, you need to take this training first. Another great thing that you can do, sometimes it's not as impactful as I wish it was, is if you can do a company-wide communication from an influential leader of your company. So maybe the CEO does an email and says, hey, accessibility training is really important. Even better if the CEO took the accessibility training, that is even more convincing. And you can convince a few people to take the training that way. And then if you still have a bunch of people after all these things, they still haven't taken their training, tie it to their promotion, okay? I've had the experience where if people, I could have been telling them to take their training 1,000 times and they never have time, but as soon as they need my approval to get promoted, and I'm like, sorry, you haven't taken your accessibility training, they get it done that afternoon. So these are all the different kinds of touch points, and maybe actually, does anyone have any touch points that I haven't mentioned here that have worked for them? I would love to hear. All right, well, someone has one. Go ahead.
So in the educational environment, when you have all that back to school stuff and you have those large scale teachers meetings for teachers that were already there, like the pre-service kind of trainings and everything before each school year works too. It also works as you got to do this before you can leave.
Oh.
Like before teachers leave for the summer,
Right.
they have to do this training.
Nice, that's
And
smart.
we host our training through a portal called Safe Schools.
Okay.
And we also have the tracking so we know who has done it, and it sends you repeated emails
Yeah.
when you haven't done it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Oh, someone else has one.
Real quick, we might need you to use that microphone for now. People are saying that
In higher ed.
Oh,
and
okay.
We trained about 1,000 people this year, and that's about all the people who will willingly come to a training. And so now we're going to department meetings, and we're asking for the first 15 minutes of a department meeting, and just kind of showing we're going to teach you one skill at the beginning of your department meeting to get the people who will not willingly come to a training.
I need that mic now. My mic's not working very well for the people on the Zoom call. Thank you. I like that. I like that idea. All right. Can everyone hear me? Can we do a bit of a sound check? Is this one working? Amazing. Okay. Thank you for whoever reported that. I appreciate it. All right. The last thing that I want to talk about before we leave the training section is training the trainer. Okay, so you really don't want to be a bottleneck. You don't want to be the only person at your company who has a clue about accessibility. So what I've described on this slide is how we do the train the trainer approach at Publicis Sapient. So what we do is we provide our foundational training and our role-specific training and checklists, all the things to the teams, including their team lead. And then we have our accessibility specialist work with that team and conduct detailed accessibility reviews on all of their work, but we provide our actionable feedback to their team lead, okay? And then we gradually transition to a point where the team lead takes over the accessibility reviews, but this is important. We stick around to do spot checks on the team lead's efforts. Because, you could have the best training in the world, but you're not going to be able to cover all of those edge cases that we love that come up. So you need to still be around, and the team lead has to get to a point where people escalating to you and asking questions. I always love a team lead who is not afraid to ask me a question, and I encourage them, please,
So the sound is
any
out
small
again.
doubt that you have, just reach out, I'm right here. Okay, so you can get to a place where, you have upskilled another person who can just take care of that part of the work for you. All right, so this was our prerequisites section, our foundational requirements. We talked about 4 things. So assessing and documenting your current state of accessibility for your digital experience, creating that really important component safe list that we're going to come back to again, setting accessibility milestones for your team, and setting up team training and onboarding. Any questions or thoughts on any of this stuff before I jump into the main part of the presentation? Okay. All right, so let's jump in. This is the main thing. Okay, this is where I was trying to get to. embedding sustainable accessibility practices. And we are going to talk about 3 key topics in this section. So number 1, how to do a process audit. And I don't know what the official name for this is. If anyone knows a better name, they can let me know. I'm going to tell you what that is on the next slide. Number 2, we're going to talk about how to integrate accessibility considerations into each phase of your content publishing workflow. And number 3, we are going to do a deep dive on how to apply governance to our accessibility processes. Okay, so what's a process audit? So in the first section there, we talked about doing an accessibility audit, right, to get that baseline. And I think everyone knows what an accessibility audit is. It's just when you assess your experience to find the accessibility issues, right? So what I'm calling a process audit is when you actually go a little bit deeper and you assess the processes that led to those issues that you found in the accessibility audit. With the idea being that if you could fix those processes, you could eventually get to this wonderful place where those accessibility issues never reoccur. That would be a wonderful place, am I right? Yeah. All right. So how do you do a process audit? Ooh, I thought the music was like... the music swells as we start to talk about process audits. Is everything okay? Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is just a really high-level overview, how to do a process audit. We're going to go really into detail, but just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. Okay, I would love to test that one more time. No, that's okay. Okay. Some feedback from people on how it's working. How does everyone think it's working? Is it garbled still? How's it going?
It sounds great.
Amazing. Okay, cool. All right. All right. So, how to do a process audit. So, the first thing that you want to do is examine your current state digital publishing workflows from planning stage all the way through to publishing. And then you want to identify opportunities within your current state workflow to embed accessibility at key stages. And then finally, you want to propose improved future workflows that include accessibility. Okay, so let's show how that could work. So I'm showing on my screen a hypothetical content publishing workflow with no accessibility reviews. And I understand, we all work slightly different ways. This is just meant to be a standardized view of a content publishing workflow. And hopefully it's recognizable to everybody. So it's split into 3 phases. Hopefully we all have a planning phase where we work that involves defining content goals, creating a brief. We call it a brief at Sapiens. This is just an update request, basically. A concept planning stage where people plan out how to meet the requirements of the brief, and then an approval on that. And then we move into the creation phase. So that is where all your writing, designing, and feature development happens, each activity with its own requisite approval. And then finally, we move into the publishing phase, which involves authoring the content, testing it, getting it approved, and then finally launching. Okay, so this content publishing workflow right now, it's very sad. It has no accessibility reviews. Team just pumps that stuff out, and then we audit it later and find tons of issues. Okay, so when we do a process audit, what we do, one of the things we do is we propose updated workflows that consider accessibility after every stage. Okay, so I just turned on a bunch of accessibility reviews in the midst of this content publishing workflow. I'm just going to go back. Previously, these are all the same activities, but now I've kind of squished them off to the side and added all of these different accessibility reviews. But that's not all that we do. We also review all of the deliverables from each stage for accessibility. And this could be the deliverable template, and then also examples of the deliverable, as it's moving through the process. Right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into detail about the accessibility considerations for each of these phases: planning, creation, and publishing. We're going to do it one at a time, and then we're going to look at all the different deliverables for each one and talk about what can go wrong. Okay? All right, so starting with the planning phase. So I'm just showing on my screen now just my content publishing workflow for the planning phase only. And there are 2 accessibility reviews that I want to talk about for this phase. This is what we find is commonly missing when we help our clients. So number 1, assessing the brief template and the brief itself for accessibility concerns. And then the second one is reviewing the content planning processes. So how do teams get to a place where they have an idea to meet the requirements for that brief? All right, so let's dive into section 1, accessibility considerations for the brief. So this first one might not seem accessibility related, but I notice with some of my clients, they don't even have a brief template. Like the request can come in like 10 different ways. And so what I try and get them to do as a first step is just, can you figure out a standardized way that people make a request? Because it's much easier for us to control and make sure that accessibility considerations are there if people are always requesting things the same way. So while it's not technically related to accessibility, it's just more of a best practice, I do include it here. If you can get to a place where that's a standardized template, that's going to be very helpful for you. The second thing is the brief template should mention accessibility as a baseline requirement. Okay, so right at the top of the brief or the content request template, it should say something like, all new features must comply with accessibility requirements, or I have on my screen, they must comply with WCAG 2.2 AA, if your teams know what that means. And the point of having that there is it just facilitates the conversation that you must have with stakeholders if they're requesting something that's inherently inaccessible. Okay, so for example, just to be ridiculous, if a stakeholder made a request and it was, I want to have a scrolling marquee across the homepage that blinks and flashes. So as an accessibility specialist, I'm going to have some concerns with that request. And so if it says right at the top of the request, all the requests must be accessible. It's so easy for me to say to the stakeholder, like, oh, oopsie, your request doesn't meet accessibility requirements. So let's talk about what your content goals are, and I can try and help you meet them in an accessible way, right? So we're not just saying no, we're just saying, oh, reminder, you need to meet these accessibility requirements up front. And then finally, you want to add an accessibility review of the request as a standard step in the process. You don't want that to be the thing that happens while you're doing the process audit, and then you go away and just the stakeholder can request anything they want again, like whatever inaccessible thing that they want. And in order to do this, you really need to have an accessibility specialist as part of that intake team. Okay, so you're just there and you're just making sure that everything that someone's asking for up front is accessible, or if it's not, you can explain why and you can try and steer them in another direction. So that's the brief. So moving on to concept planning. This is the part where there's a request for new content or functionality. Usually with the clients I work with, it's the creative team who is tasked with determining the best way to meet the requirements of that brief. So again, my first one doesn't seem to have anything to do with accessibility, but just someone on the creative team needs to know the full component library. And this might seem obvious, and maybe in your organization, I don't know how big your component library is, but some of our clients have massive component libraries with like 300 components with 10 variations for many of them. And it's been shocking to me to work with their creative team and come to realize that the people on that team don't even know what all the components are. So, and the reason why we really want them to know what all the components are is so that they don't reinvent the wheel. Every time the stakeholder wants something, they're like, great, we'll make a new component. Like, no, we need someone to know that component library, because every time we add something new to our library, it's a new opportunity to introduce accessibility issues and just, make a mess of things. Is it not working again?
It is not.
Ah.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I think we should just stick with using this one just in case, because this one seems to be reliable. Working fine though, so.
All right. It's all good? Still working? Perfect. Okay, so yes, and the other thing is the creative team it might have new people on the team, and so it's going to be a large undertaking for them to get to know all of the components, but it's really important that someone gets to know them. And I have an idea, maybe that person should be you as the accessibility specialist. It really made things a lot easier for me when I got to a place where I knew all of those 300 components, because then I could just be in there in the intake meeting saying, no, I hear what you're saying. I think you need this component, and I could show them. And maybe that should be my role. Maybe it shouldn't be my role. But it helped make the site more accessible, the fact that I knew all of those components. The other thing is, someone on the team needs to advocate for preferred use of components from our safe list. Remember our safe list? So as the accessibility specialist on this team, you could say, if someone comes and they request that component that has a bunch of high severity issues associated with it, and the full component library, then you can say, hey, don't use that one, use this one over here. And of course, you could also offer, yes, you can use that one, but you need to build time into your project to fix the issues, which is a great thing, right? Now, sometimes the stakeholder is going to come and have an idea for a new component that they want, and they'll have a point. Okay, there really is no component in the component library that does that. It makes sense to make a new one, but as an accessibility specialist, you can help ground those decisions to innovate. All right, so those are the things that we think about during the planning phase. Any questions? Anything you think I missed? Anything that you think about during the planning phase? All right, let's move on to the creation phase. All right, so during the creation phase, we usually recommend doing 3 accessibility reviews. So the first one is reviewing the manuscript templates and any proposed written content for accessibility. The next is reviewing the wireframes and visual designs for accessibility. And the third one is documenting accessibility requirements for developers. So let's jump into the first one, accessibility reviews of proposed written content. So the first thing that you want to do is check the manuscript template to make sure that it's possible for a writer to include accessibility attributes. So when I'm talking about a manuscript template, you might call it a different thing where you work, but the writer is proposing the content to put onto the site. They have to put it in some kind of format. Typically, we recommend that there be some kind of manuscript template that they fill out. And I'm going to show you an example of one on the next screen and show you what kind of accessibility attributes that I think need to be included. And I think it'll just make a whole lot more sense when I show you the next slide. But just before we do that, similar to the briefs, you want to add an accessibility review of manuscripts by an accessibility specialist as a standard step in the process. So again, it's not just while you're doing the process audit, you want them to get in the habit of always having someone review the manuscript. And the really important thing is that they get the manuscript reviewed, they incorporate your accessibility feedback, and then they show the stakeholders. Okay, we don't want to show the stakeholders anything that hasn't been reviewed for accessibility. So let's look at an example of a manuscript. So I'm showing a manuscript on my screen, the manuscript for approval. It's called The Importance of Digital Accessibility. Okay, so what this is it's just a document that has a bunch of different types of content. It doesn't really matter what it is, but there are headings, there are paragraphs, there's links, and there's images. Okay, and this is like a typical tool set that a writer would work with when they're defining what content to put on the site. Okay, so I have highlighted some things though. So your manuscript today might include a spot for headings. So what's the heading? What is a subheading? But what it might not include is exactly what heading level the writer thinks that should have. Okay, and maybe today your writers might not know exactly about heading levels, but it won't take them long to learn. Like, writers are really great at defining their own document structure, just once they understand what the difference is between all the different heading levels. So that is something that you need to have on the manuscript. The writer themselves is the best person to pick which heading level something is. Okay, we also have an image on here. So in this case, the writer has provided some alternate text. Well, there has to be a spot in that manuscript to put the alternate text. And there's a couple reasons for this. So first of all, I want to review what they wrote as an accessibility specialist, but also something that the team often forgets is that the stakeholders should approve that content as well. Does this happen on your teams? They get the stakeholders to approve only the content that the stakeholder can see. If the stakeholder can't see it, then who cares, right? That's terrible. The stakeholder should understand, here's all the content that different people will get, so you need to consider all of it and approve all of it. Or if you have, changes, obviously, you can suggest those. So now that I'm talking about reviewing this for accessibility, so first we want to make sure that it's possible for them to document these accessibility attributes. And then as an accessibility specialist, there are a whole bunch of things on here that you can review. So the headings, okay? I don't know about your teams, but lots of times the teams I work with use really jargony or vague or marketing headings that don't really mean anything. They don't describe the section that they're above. So I can suggest to them, right? Hey, this is kind of vague. Let me show you how the rotor works, and I can show you the headings on the page. Someone's supposed to use that as sort of a table of contents to jump to the section that's interesting for them. How are they going to know what that's about? It's too vague. Why don't you call it this? I can propose things, and we can work together. The other thing I can say is, maybe they've defined the wrong heading levels, so I can help them understand that so that they do it right the next time. There's a link in here, so maybe they use one of those read more links that we can't stand, and I can explain to them one-on-one, hey, you need to describe the purpose of the interaction when you write a link. You're going to this page, let me propose a link label that works. So you're teaching them, and they're getting to learn on the job, which is better than any training that you could give, although they should have taken their training. And then finally, maybe their image alternate text is wrong. Maybe they've included things like image of or picture of or whatever, and you can steer them toward the right way to write alternate text. So this is why I say that this needs to happen every single time that they submit a manuscript. They should always get it checked for accessibility, always get that learning, always incorporate the feedback, and then they can show their stakeholder afterwards. All right, so that's writing. The next section is accessibility reviews of the proposed experience and visual design. So this first one, again, I like to take the first one and make it not have anything to do with accessibility, really. So in this one, I always encourage designers to only design with actual content and not placeholder content. And this will be kind of a funny thing, like depending on how your team works together in that content planning kind of stage. Sometimes it's more waterfall-y, like the writer will write something first and then it goes to the designer or the wireframe and then they make the mock-up, etc. Or sometimes it's backwards and the designer is just trying to think of a cool layout and they don't even know what the content is yet. And so what I've found in my experience is that when they're doing it I'm calling it backwards, when they just try and think of a layout without knowing what the content's going to be, that is never usable. It's never as good, it's never as powerful as if they wrote it first. So I always encourage them, please try and get that actual content before you start designing. And then similar to briefs and the manuscript, you want to add an accessibility review of wireframes and designs by an accessibility specialist as a standard step. There were too many ideas that I had about things that can go wrong in a wireframe or a design. I'm sure we're all familiar with those. And so you need to have a standard step in the process where an accessibility specialist is looking at that and checking it out and giving the designer some coaching, similar to the manuscript. And then again, similar to the manuscript, you want to have them incorporate that accessibility feedback as part of their updated process and then show stakeholders. So again, I just keep saying this over and over again, only present accessible work to stakeholders. And I have a person on my screen and I'm kind of crossing them out because I don't like what they're saying. This is what someone says to me all the time. Hey, you know what? We're running out of time. Can't we just show the stakeholder the designs now and get them reviewed for accessibility later? So this an assumption that they're making that everything's probably fine and it's just checking a box, right? But what we all know is that it's hardly ever fine. And we don't want the stakeholder to fall in love with some design that ends up being inaccessible and we have to completely change it, because that's an awkward conversation. It's inefficient. It requires rework. And if we only present accessible work to stakeholders, then that's going to build trust and set a really nice standard for inclusivity. Okay, so really important to try and get this process happening. All right, and then finally, the last thing that we're going to talk about in the creation phase is documenting requirements for developers. Okay, so you don't need to document everything for a developer. Like, presumably they should know how to code. You shouldn't have to tell them how to code. I like to give as a rule of thumb for designers is like, tell them how it should behave, right? And then let them figure out how to code it. As long as it behaves the way that you want it to behave, it's probably fine. And if it's not, then we'll catch it. But what are some things that you really should document for them? So I suggest that you document and this is great because I'm talking to a room full of accessibility specialists. It can be really hard for a designer to do this if they're not an accessibility specialist. Keyboard functionality for non-native controls. So I'm thinking of things like a carousel, for example. Like, there's no standard way that a carousel works. Even better if you can get them to not have the carousel at all. That would be my favorite. But if there has to be a carousel, there's probably a specific way it's intended to work, and you really need to tell the developer exactly how it needs to work so that they build it the right way. Another thing that you can tell the developers is about the document structure. So for example, what landmarks they should apply to the page and what the names for those landmarks should be. You can help them out with that. And then a lot of times in our work, I find out that we have really complex headings that we need to code. So for example, maybe the designer has like a little eyebrow and then a larger heading. So there's sort of a decision point of, well, is that all the same heading, or is that like an H2 followed by an H3? So you figure out what the intention is, and you might have to explain that to a developer. It might not be obvious. Another thing that we can tell them about is how the screen reader is supposed to announce things. So something could visually update on the page, how does that get announced? Where does the focus go? Focus handling is another one that we can tell developers because they don't inherently know where the focus is supposed to go when a modal opens, for example, or that, the escape key should close the modal and where should the focus go after that. So we might have to give them guidance in these areas. And then finally, the content management system or the authoring tool might have some fields that are required for accessibility compliance. And I'm going to show you that in one of the next sections. And then we can define that and make sure that they build that authoring tool the right way. All right, so those were the creation phase accessibility reviews. We talked about manuscript templates, reviewing written content as part of the flow, reviewing wireframes and visual designs as part of the flow for accessibility, and then documenting accessibility requirements for developers. Anything anyone want to chat about before we move on to publishing phase? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
If we go back one slide about the, sorry, making you go back and forth. But in the requirement documentation for developers, how would you suggest that we track or document evidence of their commitments of doing this extra work in their build phase? Like, if they were to follow a checklist, how do they kind of annotate or kind of like keep track of that in their releases?
Thank you. That is a great question. So the great thing about documenting requirements is that they're documented. So now the QA team can test against them because the QA team also knows exactly what's supposed to happen. Now, I know it's not the same as a testing, like making sure that the developer does everything perfectly before they submit their code to QA, but we have no control over that anyway, right? Like, a developer can do a million things wrong, not just accessibility, and then the normal process flow is to have the QA team test against the requirements. But where it falls apart is if we haven't documented, for example, how the carousel is supposed to work, then the QA team doesn't know how it's supposed to work either. So that could end up in them logging a bunch of issues that are not really issues, or maybe they don't even test it because they don't really know how it's supposed to work. Maybe they don't normally test with the keyboard. But what I find with our QA teams is if I specifically say, when this gets focused with the keyboard, when you hit the enter key, this is what's supposed to happen, they will test it because they're just following the requirements, right? So that's kind of, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's kind of how we make sure that they do it, just the same way that we make sure that they do anything. Now we just have accessibility as part of that as well. Is that good for you? Your voice says yes, but your face says no. You sure?
Yeah, I guess I was just curious about directing the QA folks to like the releases to check, especially if the developers are learning about accessibility for the first time and are on the acquiring stage of knowledge instead of application. So I think there's like a huge learning curve, and the QA is very important to kind of fill those gaps.
Okay, yeah, that helps. And I'm going to come back to your question, Patrick. So part of this is, what I recommend is that you have an accessibility specialist guiding the team through this whole process. This is kind of where I'm getting to, right? Like, even everyone talks about shifting left. I think that accessibility specialist should be there when the brief gets passed over, right? And I think that they should follow throughout the whole process, and they're there. If the developer has any questions, maybe they have a meeting with the developers. Hey, do these requirements that I wrote make sense? Do you know how to test this with your keyboard? And then remember, we had our foundational training and we had our role-specific training. So our developers at this point, if they took the training, because the project just started, so at the start of the project, we told them you have to take the training. So now they know how to use a screen reader and they know how to use their keyboard. So it's like a lot to set up, but you'll get there. You'll get to a place where everything's sort of set up. Does that help? Okay.
I was just going to comment about like communicating requirements to developers and using like annotations with like Figma, tools like Figma, where you can put explicit instructions in, like this needs to be coded as a button versus a div with a role of a button, so you can get like really kind of granular in by using like tools like Figma in the designs, and that way it's documented. It's right there for everybody to see. Even the QA team can go back and look at it and see what the requirements are. So.
Thanks, Patrick. And actually, I have a whole section at the back in the appendix that has a bunch of examples of how to document requirements for developers. So thanks for saying that, Patrick. Sure.
I was actually just going to say that that's actually what we do in our company, is we have design reviews for accessibility that then involve marking up the Figma designs so that the developers know how to code things and what the accessible names should be. And I think that's been pretty well received across the organization. Sorry to...
No, thanks, Amy. Yeah, that's great. I mean, we started doing this several years ago, and it's been working out pretty well. Not all of the projects that we have started using this approach, but the projects that use this approach are doing very well. So you can get this into place. It is achievable. All right, so that was it for creation phase accessibility reviews. I think we just had our questions, so I'm going to pop ahead here to the publishing phase. All right, so I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of reviews in this section. So first, the accessibility review of the authoring tool. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. I know I mentioned it previously. The second section is establishing accountability for accessibility sign-off. Some really important processes to get in place here. And then finally, establishing effective accessibility governance. All right, so let's just jump into this authoring tool section. So just everyone knows what I mean by authoring tool. When you're authoring content into a component on the website, it usually looks like filling out some kind of form, depending on which tool you're using. So it's important that that form that you're filling out has fields for accessibility attributes. And this is like the kind of thing that we were talking about before. If I can author a heading, I should be able to author a heading level without changing the appearance of the heading, so that I can stick that component anywhere on the page and make the heading level correct for wherever I put it within that content hierarchy. Ideally, your authoring tool is going to allow the content author to identify any accessibility issues during content authoring, and most of them do this. I haven't encountered one lately that doesn't have like a preview where you can look at the page you just authored and use an extension or something just to see if you forgot to author something that you should have authored. And then finally, it's really great if you can have, if it's a custom authoring tool that you're building, you can add prompts, tips, instructions to guide authors in creating accessible content. It just really does help have fewer content authoring accessibility issues if there's instructions in place, just to make sure that people know how they're supposed to do things. So I'm going to show you an example of just an authoring interface with fields for accessibility attributes, just to kind of emphasize what I was talking about. So what I'm showing here is website output for a component that allows a person to find diseases and conditions by first letter. So what it has is a whole set of links, one for each letter of the alphabet, and the visual link label for that link is just the letter. Okay, so that wouldn't provide very much context for someone who is navigating by links. They would all of a sudden just hear link A or link A, and they wouldn't know what that was for. So we thought it was important to provide additional context to get announced by a screen reader. So in this case, if we're looking at this link for the letter P link, the visual link is just a P, and then the announce link is P, find a condition that begins with the letter P. Okay, so now everybody knows what that link does. But if that was the intended behavior when we designed the component, we really need to tell the developer to add an extra field in the authoring tool so that someone can author what that announce text is. And then, maybe that screen reader text just ends up being an ARIA label. However the developer wants to do it, as long as it behaves this way, then that will work for me. So here we have a field for the interaction label. So that's the visual label that someone can see, and it's a letter P. And then the screen reader text is what someone called it here. P, find a condition that begins with the letter P. Okay, but if we didn't tell the developer this, if we didn't write requirements for this, I'm pretty confident that there's no way that they would have landed on this. Okay, it wouldn't have worked, and it would have ended up along the line in that accessibility audit, as a severity 1 issue. All right, so the next section that I want to talk about is establishing accountability for accessibility sign-off. So this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier. You want to be prepared for when accessibility issues inevitably arise, because they will. Even with all of your efforts, something's going to go wrong, and there's going to be some kind of issue at the end when you're testing something and deciding if it can launch. So a few things that you should put in place and let everyone on the team know so that they expect it is the minimum acceptable accessibility level. So for example, I have here WCAG 2.2 level AA. And then the other thing that you want to establish is clear launch criteria for that minimum acceptable accessibility compliance level. And I'm going to show you a launch decision matrix on the next slide. And then finally, you want to designate a decision maker who's responsible for go, no-go determinations. And just a hint, it shouldn't be you. As the accessibility specialist, a lot of times people try and put that on me, but I always defer to legal. Okay, so here is an example of a launch decision matrix. So how does this work? We have some new functionality that people created. It's just about to launch. It's in our publishing phase. It's on staging, and we're all testing it. And I come in and I assess it for accessibility issues. And let's say that I don't find any accessibility issues. So 0 issue count. So from my perspective, from the accessibility perspective, that content can launch, no problem. Okay. But what if I did find issues? So this is where I assign severity level to the issue based on my framework of my definitions that we all know and agreed upon. And so let's say that that issue that I found, I've assigned it a P3 or an S3, sorry. So that means, according to this launch decision matrix, the functionality can launch, But the issues are immediately added to the accessibility backlog for resolution. And then that's when we apply our governance model that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Okay, but what if it was a severity 1 or 2, so the high severity issue? So according to this launch decision matrix, that functionality cannot launch. It's just a stop, can't do it. Okay, and then that's when someone will come to me and say, hey, Allison, do you think it's okay if we launch with this serious keyboard issue? And then I say no. Like, my answer is just no. My answer is look at the launch decision matrix, and it says you're not supposed to launch. If anyone pushes on it though, like, hey, it's really important though, then we've identified the go, no go person. And so for me, with my clients, I typically get to know their legal team. And then that's when I go have a conversation with legal. Here's the impact, here's the risk, what do you want to do? And legal is usually pretty risk averse, and usually that thing is not going to launch, okay? But the point is, it's not on my shoulders to decide. And I really firmly believe if you're not in legal or on the risk team or the product owner or something, then nobody should make these things your responsibility, because you don't want it to come back to you if you wanted to do someone a solid and let them launch the thing, which I'm sure nobody here would be wanting to do anyway. You don't want it to come back to you. All right, so now the last thing we're going to talk about is establishing effective governance for accessibility issues. So we just talked about that S3 or S4 issue that we threw onto the backlog and we launched the stuff anyway. We want to have a plan for those issues that are on the backlog. We don't want them to just sit there forever and stagnate. So what I like to do is work out with my team a plan. Okay, so we want to, first of all, allocate a fixed percentage of release cycles to addressing the backlog items. And I have a 10% showing on my screen. Even better if you can get it like a little bit higher than that, 15%. So what this just means is, let's say that a client is willing to pay for the effort of 100 hours for a release. Okay, so if they've agreed to allocate 10% of their release effort to fixing accessibility issues, that just means that they're willing for the team to spend 10 hours working on fixing accessibility issues. Obviously, I'm just using simple numbers for simple math purposes. But you want to try and get that in place so that someone's always tackling that backlog from release to release. Of course, we use our prioritization framework to address the issues that have the highest impact to the user. So if in that release there was a couple P3 issues and a P4 issue, you might want to recommend that they fix the P3 issues first the next time that we had a release. But it's really great to have an accessibility specialist who's grooming the backlog, just to align the fixes with business goals and with what makes sense. Because maybe that severity 4 issue, it's a severity 4, right? So obviously it's not as important as the severity 3s. But what if fixing that severity 4, what if it was like a pervasive issue across the whole site and it's super easy to fix and it would make such a huge impact even though it's a severity 4, right? So as the accessibility specialist, you're the only one in the room who would know that. So you should be there helping groom the backlog, and you're actually recommending which accessibility issues get fixed first for each release. And then the last thing that you want to do is make sure, and this goes back to setting milestones, make sure that you're creating target goals for accessibility, documenting your progress and reporting on the outcomes, okay, so that people know what's going on. And that's what my last slide in this section is about. This is how you ensure that your leadership is engaged in accessibility. Okay, so this sentence might seem very silly, but I'm just going to tell you, if you don't provide regular reporting to senior stakeholders, they won't know the current state of accessibility, okay? They're just not going to know because nobody told them. You need to keep them informed so that they can never say that they weren't aware of the situation. And they're also the ones who can help you when you get stuck. So if I'm grooming the backlog and release after release, I keep trying to get them to fix these high severity issues, and they always say, well, we don't have time, or we're prioritizing this other thing, right? That's going to happen from time to time, but just like over and over and over again, right? If I'm doing quarterly reporting to my senior stakeholders or monthly reporting, and I keep telling them over and over again, yeah, we have these really high severity accessibility issues and they never get fixed. They didn't get fixed last month, they didn't get fixed this month, then some stakeholder is going to kind of wake up and say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on with these high severity issues? I'm sick of hearing about them. Let's get it done. And then because they said so, it'll get done, okay? So that was our publishing phase accessibility reviews. We talked about reviewing the authoring tool, establishing accountability for sign-off when you're publishing something, and then establishing effective accessibility governance. Any thoughts or questions before we move on? Okay, amazing. So this is it. This was our embedding sustainable accessibility practices. We talked about the process audit. We talked about integrating those considerations at each phase in the workflow and applying governance. I already asked you if you had any questions, and you didn't, so I'm going to move into section 3. Oh, someone has a question. Amazing.
Maybe you'll cover it in the next section.
I might, but I...
You talked about, so I'm speaking as, a product manager who's been in this loop, making this kind of change. But I'm also, I have a question as someone at an organization, about 3,000 people, content focused, lots of different products. And I'm thinking about how to get them to do this stuff more. And the motivator I saw there that you're kind of focusing on is the courts are coming in with a gavel that's knocking money out of your bank account. And the more money that you can get knocked out, the more you should spend on accessibility. And I wonder, in your experience, or if you have any data out there about this, if you look at all the factors that do influence an organization to say, you know what, it's worth it to spend more on accessibility, how much of it, like pie chart, is to avoid a legal problem versus other things? And what are those other things?
Thank you. That's a really great question. So, yeah. There are a few things. I mean, money's a big deal for a company, right? They want to meet their targets. So if you can show them that they're being completely inefficient, so they're losing money out of the gate, you can talk about, some of the sessions I've seen this week already have talked about the money that you lose by doing things the wrong way. Not to mention if you had suffered through some kind of lawsuit and you had financial loss from that. But I also talked about the screen reader training, right? And I think I said, and if I didn't say it, I meant to, I think I talked about the beautiful moment when people are using the screen reader, and I'm never intending for them to be experts at using a screen reader, but the beautiful moment when they realize that they don't know everything about creating digital experiences. A minute ago, they thought they did. They were pretty sure they knew everything. And now I blew their mind by showing them this whole, area that they have no clue about. And that really sparks people's empathy. And that's why I say to give screen reader training to everyone. Okay, now, but when I'm thinking of a pie chart, so it's really all intertwined, right? Like, why did my company agree to invest in an accessibility center of excellence? I tried to get them to do it for 10 years, and they finally did. And when I presented my business case, there was a mix of things, right? There was, here's a bunch of clients who got sued, right? Here's some money that we lost. Here's some work we never would have won if we didn't have these few people on the team who have accessibility credentials, so we could speak to those people in the RFP process. So here's a whole bunch of things about money. And then we talk about impact, right? Like my company is all about impact. They want to make a positive impact in the world. So I talked a lot about, people missing out on government services, for example. And so I could show, I developed a methodology to measure the accessibility of work that we were putting out in different sectors. And I showed how it was all failing. And I said, look, like you're stopping people from shopping online. Is that what you want? Like, is that the proud impact that you want to have, right? So there's some guilt in there. There's some empathy in there. There's some money in there. And it's a tough question. I mean, I don't know what's going to push the buttons at your company. Do you have an idea?
Sometimes you can kind of flip it. Like when you start the project at the beginning, you can say, well, now who's the audience? And then they can say, oh, well, we want, teachers. Okay, well, if a teacher's blind, do you want that teacher to be able to get the content? And then what are the odds? No, it's not for, right? So you start with, yes, of course we want to include everyone. This is our target. And then you can kind of say, all right, well, that's not going to happen unless we do it this way. Or, and it kind of helps to just get them thinking, wait a minute, because otherwise they just assume it's fine.
I love that. I love that because you actually touched on my favorite reason. When I give training, I often list, all the reasons why you should try and create accessible digital experiences. And my favorite reason I say is near the end, and it's like, because nobody's doing this on purpose, right? When something doesn't work, it's not because somebody said, I don't want to sell to people who, use a keyboard. Nobody's saying that. It's just what happens accidentally when we don't enable our teams to create accessible experiences. And that's the other thing that I do at my company. I make sure that I'm not heavy-handedly kind of assuming or making them feel like they're doing it on purpose, right? I always give everyone an out. You didn't learn about this in school. You had no idea about this. I'm just telling you this right now, and this is news to you. You had no clue. Wow. But guess what? This is happening. And here are some statistics, right? And usually, if you present it that way, then people are way more open to getting the message. Does that help at all? Yeah. Okay. So this section is about getting team alignment. Okay. So this actually ties in quite nicely to what we were just talking about. When you do an accessibility audit, I think we all know what the deliverable is. We give people a list of issues. We might provide a bunch of other information like how to fix it and what order to prioritize the fixes, etc. So how do you tell people how to update their processes? Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 different ways. The first is something I call a workflow accessibility gap analysis document. The second is a process change roadmap. And then the third one is just kind of, I'm covering it for completion's sake. We also want to recommend some tools because people love tools. All right, so jumping into these first 2 deliverables, and I'm going to explain what they are in case you haven't encountered them. So a workflow accessibility gap analysis, this outlines the gaps, impacts, and recommendations for improving accessibility across the content publishing workflow phases, and it assigns priorities and complexities for each issue. I'm going to show you one on the next screen. Okay. The next is a process change roadmap, and it just takes the workflow updates that you're recommending and it aligns it to a timeline. Okay, so you're kind of giving teams an idea of what they should be doing first and how long it should take them. Okay, so it allows them to kind of work on it systematically. And then we have our tools section that I'll get into. So let's get into this workflow gap analysis. First, I'm just going to tell you kind of the steps to doing it, and then I'll show it to you. So you want to identify the workflow stage, and we just painstakingly went over all of them, right? So for example, planning. You want to identify the workflow artifact. So in this case, I'm going to say, for example, the brief. You want to describe the accessibility issue and impact that's associated with the brief, provide the recommendation you have, and categorize it by priority and complexity. And so what this ends up looking like after you've defined a whole bunch of process updates is essentially a spreadsheet. Okay, this is too small though. Nobody can read this text. So I'm just going to zoom in on one of these rows. So for example, I'm going to zoom in on one of these processes and recommendations that somebody had. This is from an actual deliverable that we provided. Okay, so process is planning, creating the brief. The artifact that we reviewed is the brief itself. The issue that we uncovered is the brief does not express baseline accessibility requirements. The impact is today, the team says they often forget to consider accessibility because it's never mentioned until too late in the process. So our recommendation is what we discussed earlier. Just add a line to the brief template that expresses that all the requests need to be accessible. We've given it a priority level of 1, and the complexity is low. And low complexity just means it's really easy to do. So you can imagine if the team is getting a whole bunch of these recommendations, they can just kind of look at them and be like, oh, it's priority 1, so it's really important. And then look how easy it is. Like, why don't we just knock these out like right now, and we can update our processes with these, okay? And then the next part of this, because it all kind of works together, is to create the process change roadmap. So what you want to do is define an appropriate timeline for your plan. So for example, I often give my clients a year to do something, but maybe, it's almost June. Maybe I would try and get them to a certain point by the end of the year. So I would just define the next 6 months. And then you want to arrange the proposed updates by priority and complexity. And then really important, assign proposed owners for the updates, because if you don't do that, then no one's going to do anything. So how does this look? Okay, so let's just look at the top one. This is an example again from an actual deliverable. So for this one, the process was writing, part of the creation phase. In Q1, they recommended that the team update their manuscripts with accessibility attribute information. Of course, that's like the first thing that we got to do. Provide checklists to copywriters and designers, provide the copywriter training, and then they're saying, I want you to staff an accessibility specialist to review the manuscripts, and they're suggesting this is a new role for someone to spend half their time on. In Q2, they're saying, okay, at that point, you should be ready to assign an accessibility owner and then do the train the trainer approach for that owner on that team. And then by Q3, we should be ready to implement spot checks with that person. So it kind of shows the trajectory of how it will unfold. And I'm not saying that you'll get exactly what you want. It's not like you can just say, this is what you should do and it'll happen magically. But what it is it's a line in the sand. And it's the point to start negotiating. So maybe your client will say, there's no way that we're going to get the person ready to just rely on spot checks by Q3. That has to wait until Q4. But the point is, now everybody knows what they need to do, and they have an idea of sort of a benchmark of when you thought they could do it. So it's much more likely to happen. Okay, so that was a little bit more complicated. Another thing that we like to provide is our simplified process milestones. Okay, so this is another deliverable that someone provided for a much simpler site. There weren't a million different process updates to make, so they just divided it up into quick wins, things they thought the client could do within 3 months, empowerment, they called it, things to do within 3 to 6 months, and then embedded, things that would take until 6 to 12 months for them to get in place. And they just made these suggestions. Okay, so this might make more sense for your organization if you have a smaller team. But whichever way you do it, it's really important to create a timeline for proposed recommendations. Otherwise, it's really hard to track your progress. Okay, and you could even forget about what progress you've made if you don't keep track of it, and then that can kind of lead to you burning out. But after we have these things in place and I'm tracking it, it's like, when I'm having a really bad day, I can look back and be like, well, look at all the things that we've done, in the last 6 months. So it feels good too. All right, so this last part here, just, people are always going to want to leverage tools. So no presentation is complete about doing achieving sustainable accessibility without noting that we want to suggest reference tools to address gaps, help people speed up their workflows. But my point here that I mentioned earlier is it's better if you suggest the tool, because you're the one who knows if it's a decent tool. There are a lot of kind of substandard tools out there. You can make sure that the team is picking the right ones for their workflow. The way we set it up, I have this diagram at the side. We base everything on defining accessibility requirements. And then we recommend, contrast testing tools for UX and visual design, accessible code. We recommend the Wave toolbar, Axe and Pally, accessible content, again, Wave toolbar, Microsoft Word, spell check. Functional accessibility testing, Wave toolbar, and you'll notice I have an icon of a hand and a gear for every single one of these phases, and that is my icon that means manual testing, because I just say every single time, I always put it with my tool recommendations, and I call it a tool. Manual testing is your best tool, so make sure that you do it. All right, so this was our short end section. Ooh, someone has a question. Oh, you have a question too?
I love that we're talking so much about process, because I think that's where a lot of our problems come from. And I just wanted to ask what you thought about how much behavior we can change at a time, because sometimes I see that the folks I'm working with can only manage so much behavior change at once, or they start to backslide into previous behaviors, and then the process goes back to what it was. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about, and kind of checking in. So they said they were going to do this in months 1 through 3. Well, when you're in 6 through 9, are you checking on, are they maintaining the months 1 through 3 behaviors?
Yeah. That's a really great question. And I can tell you, we've had so much success with this method. And it's, the best success happens when we're starting something new. So starting a new project, and we just tell the team, this is how it works. You got your accessibility specialist, they're your guide, take your training. this is our process and just do it. And yes, there's like a lot of churn at the beginning because people are trying to show stuff to the stakeholder. They're running out of time. They're like, Allison, do I really have to show it to you before I show the stakeholder? Yes, you do. The best partner that you can have is the product owner. If you can get the product owner to also help push for these processes to get into place, then that works so much better. It's really horrible to be the accessibility specialist, like waving their arms in the corner going like, how come no one showed me the designs before they showed the stakeholder? Like you really need, your project manager, program manager to help make sure that they're enforcing so they have it part of the definition of done, for example. They have the requirements defined in the ticket. They understand the process. So they're saying, hey, you said you're done the design, but did you get Allison to review it? And maybe they didn't, right? And so then when you do it that way, they can handle those changes. Like they can do it. I've seen it work beautifully in the end. Like it's always kind of a struggle at the beginning, or often kind of a struggle, but I've seen them do it. Yeah, thank you. That was a good question. Anyone else? I have a little summary. I'm not gonna read all of these things, but we talked about our foundational requirements, our prerequisites, right? We talked about embedding sustainable accessibility practices into our ways of working. We talked about implementing our sustainable accessibility strategy and how we can communicate that in an actionable way for our teams. And what I thought I would share with you is just kind of my idea of the key elements of sustainable accessibility so that, it's like kind of your sustainable accessibility bingo card, if you will. So let's say that all your accessibility issues are prioritized within a backlog. Okay, that's a great step. There's a remediation strategy that has been created to deal with those existing issues. You have a dashboard where you can see your component safe list, very helpful. You have an onboarding process at your company, on your project, that includes telling people to take that accessibility training. You have accessibility reviews happening at every stage. Sometimes it might kind of slip and slide, but for the most part, they're there. Your key publishing workflow artifacts include accessibility considerations. You have a process change roadmap in place for things that aren't quite working. You have a target date for when they're supposed to be working. You have a governance process in place to deal with any accessibility issues intentionally. And the current state of accessibility is reported to stakeholders at regular intervals. If you have all this stuff in place, then you're in pretty good shape, or you will be in good shape in a couple of months, and it's always good to have a plan, right? So, have all that in place, escape the remediation cycle, achieve sustainable accessibility, have a happy life. It's all good. I want to thank you for all the engagement in the session. I have the QR code up there again if you missed it the first time. Also happy to answer any questions at this time if anyone has any more questions. All right. Well, thanks, everyone.